Jenny slowly entered the hotel room, glancing around with her usual attentiveness. She already knew there wouldn't be much work here. Change the bed linens, dust off the surfaces, and remove a cup of unfinished coffee from the coffee table. According to the standard procedure, she still had to check the bathroom, but that didn't worry her in the slightest. As she suspected, the previous guest was an elderly man, well-groomed, polite, and clearly quite well off. It was Mr. Theodore Perkins, the one her colleagues had mentioned. He wasn't just a businessman but the head of a large company. From the very first moment, Jenny understood that a man like Mr. Perkins couldn't be an ordinary guest. Years of working in the hotel had taught her to distinguish between people. Guests like him never caused trouble for the housekeeping staff. They were tidy, courteous, and careful with their belongings. Cleaning a room like this would only take a few minutes. Jenny walked over to the nightstand to check if the guest had left anything important behind or perhaps a tip. She wasn't wrong. On the nightstand was a small stack of bills. Jenny counted the money and could hardly contain her joy. There was just enough to buy her kids their school uniforms. September was just around the corner, and preparations for the new school year were in full swing. Jenny mentally thanked Mr. Perkins and wished him success in his business before continuing with her cleaning. As she reached the bed, something made her pause. Lifting one of the pillows, Jenny noticed a small object, an old locket, made of cheap metal, clearly not worth much. However, its simplicity and wear didn't fit the image of the respectable, wealthy Mr. Perkins. He wore an expensive watch on his wrist, and his suit was undoubtedly tailored by a well-known designer. But this locket, it seemed like it belonged to someone completely different. Jenny picked it up. The metal was dented in a few places, but overall, the locket was clean, without rust or visible damage, suggesting it had been cared for and cherished. Curiosity got the best of her. She brought the locket closer to her eyes and noticed that it could be opened. Her fingers naturally unlocked it, and inside was an old, black and white photograph of a young woman. She was smiling, showing strong white teeth, with dark eyes and a braid wrapped neatly around her head in a vintage style. Jenny froze, hardly believing what she saw. The young woman in the photograph looked eerily familiar. Jenny touched the mole above her upper lip. An identical mole adorned the face of the girl in the picture. There was no doubt about it. She was looking at a portrait of her own grandmother, Evelyn. Jenny's heart began to race. She recognized that photograph. She had seen it many times in the old family album. Her grandmother often told the story of how a photographer had come to their small town, which was a big event at the time. On that day, Evelyn had carefully prepared for the photo shoot. She dressed in her best outfit and even put on a little lipstick to look especially attractive against the bright summer sun and the green branches of the weeping willows. Her grandmother had long since passed away, but the memory of her still lived in Jenny's heart. She had struggled with her passing, as Evelyn had been more than just a grandmother to her. She had been like a mother, raising her, surrounding her with love and care during the years when Jenny needed support the most. Jenny's thoughts swirled around this unexpected discovery. How could it be that a photograph of her beloved grandmother ended up in Mr. Theodore Perkins' locket? Clearly, there was some connection between these two people that Jenny couldn't ignore. She wondered why this elderly businessman carried a picture of her grandmother. Could it be that he was a collector of vintage items and had accidentally come across Evelyn's photograph, perhaps purchasing it at some flea market? Or was there a deeper, more meaningful connection between them that Jenny knew nothing about. These troubling thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. But she knew her children would manage. Alana was already 14, practically a grown woman, smart and responsible. Stephen was 13, just a year younger than his sister, but his maturity and sense of responsibility often surprised even Jenny. He always took on the role of the older brother, protecting and caring for his younger sister. Little Olivia was only 6, but the older siblings knew how to get along with her. They had taken care of the little one without their mother's help before. Jenny was often at work, staying late into the evening, trying to earn enough so her children wouldn't go without. Alana and Stephen understood this better than many adults and willingly took on some of her household duties without complaint or resentment. Sometimes Jenny couldn't believe she had managed to raise such wonderful children. They were no longer little, they had become her support, just as she had once been for her grandmother. Yet, despite this, the future of her children worried her. Jenny was anxious about whether they would be able to handle the challenges life had in store for them. She hoped they would get a good education, find their place in the world, and achieve success. Alana had always been a bright girl with great potential. Stephen, though more reserved by nature, was serious and had the ability to focus on what was important. Olivia was still too young, but Jenny believed she, too, would follow the right path. Thoughts of her children's future led Jenny to reflect on her own past. As she mechanically wiped down surfaces in the room, her mind wandered far beyond the confines of the hotel. The unexpected discovery of her grandmother Evelyn's photograph took Jenny back to those distant years when she was still a child, when the world seemed both simple and impossibly complex. Her life had begun with a difficult start. She was the result of a brief romance between her mother, Helen, and a father she never knew. Helen had been a carefree, flighty girl, easily infatuated, and by the age of 18, she had already experienced several fleeting crushes. Jenny recalled her grandmother's stories. Helen had always been that way, restless, impulsive. She barely managed to get through school, preferring fun crowds and dates over studying. She was drawn to an exciting, fast-paced life, and school seemed dull and unnecessary. Helen easily made friends but especially enjoyed the company of older men who could afford to buy her gifts and take her out to restaurants. Evelyn, a strong and resilient woman, had raised 5 children on her own after her husband tragically died while rescuing a drowning woman. He had been the backbone of the family, but he was gone when their youngest son was barely a month old. Jenny remembered how her grandmother always said that all her sons had grown up to be good, hard-working, and responsible men, but with Helen, everything had gone wrong. She had always been different, lazy, moody, and during her teenage years, it was as if a rebellious spirit had taken hold of her. Skipping school, secret dates, defiance, these things overwhelmed Evelyn, who was used to order and discipline. The neighbors advised Evelyn to be stricter and to punish her daughter for her behavior, but despite her strict upbringing, Jenny's grandmother couldn't bring herself to lay a hand on Helen. Once, after a particularly tough meeting with Helen's teachers, Evelyn had picked up a switch, but when she saw the frightened look on her daughter's face, her hand trembled, and she couldn't go through with it. Evelyn had always believed that Helen would settle down with age, just like the other women in their family. She hoped that after finishing school, her daughter would come to her senses, find a decent job, and perhaps build a life for herself in the city. But Helen had no interest in her mother's advice. She insisted on her own dreams. She longed to move to the city, where, In her mind, there was big money to be made, and life was full of opportunities. It was there, standing on the doorstep of her own home, that Evelyn had no idea she had become a grandmother once again. Now she had 3 grandchildren, 2 from her eldest son and 1 from her daughter. Helen showed up unexpectedly, with a baby in her arms, and without saying a word, walked straight into the house. Evelyn, shocked, watched her daughter and the infant, struggling to grasp what was happening. It turned out that Helen had been living for a while with a much older man named Eugene. He had come from another city after falling out with his family and had started a new life, finding solace in endless parties and wild living with Helen. What brought them together was their mutual love for a carefree, reckless lifestyle, constant parties, and noisy crowds. Eugene worked in construction, earning money irregularly, but sometimes in decent amounts that sustained them. He was a rough man, but such men were often hired for odd jobs, and if not for his drinking habit, as Helen said, he would have been a great catch. Everything was going as usual until Helen realized she was pregnant. Eugene didn't take the news joyfully at first, but he soon figured out that children meant extra benefits and allowances. Although he didn't feel much fatherly affection, he stopped insisting on terminating the pregnancy. However, by the time Helen gave birth, their life had changed. Eugene had somehow reconciled with his wife and returned to her, leaving Helen alone with the newborn. After being discharged from the hospital, Helen lived in their rented apartment for a while, which had been paid for until the end of the month, but soon she had no choice but to return home to her mother. Where else could she go? Evelyn, though she sighed heavily, accepted her daughter Helen and granddaughter into her home. She pitied Helen, assuring her that together they would manage and that life would get better. In fact, Evelyn was somewhat relieved that Helen had returned with a child. She hoped that motherhood would change her, that caring for her daughter would help Helen mature and see life differently. After all, Evelyn believed that having children always made people grow up. However, reality was far from her expectations. Soon after leaving her daughter Jenny in her mother's care, Helen left for the city again. Evelyn never saw a penny from the child benefits Helen continued to receive. Helen spent the money on her own needs in the city, while her grandmother raised little Jenny on her own. It was hard for her, but she never complained, as her granddaughter became a source of joy and light in her life. Jenny grew up in her arms like a little ray of sunshine, brightening the house with her presence. Helen rarely visited, and when she did, it was only when she urgently needed money or had nowhere to stay for the night. She felt no attachment to Jenny and came to her mother only when her own life had hit a dead end. Neighbors whispered that Evelyn should have long ago stripped her daughter of parental rights, saying it would make things easier for her and that the benefits would be greater. But Evelyn couldn't bring herself to take that step. Helen was her only daughter, and deep down, she still clung to the hope that one day she would change for the better. But that hope slowly faded. As Jenny grew older, she realized that her mother had never been a real presence in her life. Too distant, too disconnected, Helen never evoked the warm, familial feelings a mother should. When Evelyn passed away, Jenny found herself even more isolated. It felt as if the ground had fallen from beneath her feet. The young girl, barely 16, had to find a new home. Relatives, the family of her eldest uncle, took her in, but even there, she felt like an outsider. Her uncle's wife tried to hide her disdain for Jenny, but Jenny could feel it and understood everything. Even her uncle treated her with coolness, not to mention her cousins, who had resented her mother Helen since childhood for the troubles she had brought into their lives. Jenny remained alone, even though she was surrounded by family. But she knew she couldn't count on them. The young college student, Jenny, faced a whirlwind of challenges when life threw her into unexpected difficulties. Not long ago, she had been immersed in her studies, making plans for the future, but the sudden news of her pregnancy turned her world upside down. School took a back seat, and as she became consumed with caring for her baby, Jenny missed her exams, leading to her dismissal from college. It was expected. Juggling studies with a newborn was impossible. With a heavy heart and no other options, she returned to the small country home of her late grandmother, Evelyn. This wise woman, who had passed away some time ago, had left her home to Jenny, sensing that her granddaughter's path in life would not be easy. Evelyn's sons were outraged. They believed they had a right to the house too, but their mother brushed off their complaints, saying, "You're established, you'll be fine." But Jenny needs her own space, somewhere she can come back to. Jenny overheard those words and silently thanked her grandmother for this gift. However, the house had fallen into disrepair during Jenny's absence. No one had cared for it, the roof leaked, and the walls were crumbling. But this didn't scare Jenny. Though small and run down, it was her home, her sanctuary, a place where she could feel safe. With her own hands, though inexperienced, she began fixing the house, determined to make it somewhat livable and cozy. Then little Alyssa was born, a tiny being destined to change Jenny's life completely. As she gazed at her daughter, Jenny's heart filled with a warmth and tenderness she had never known. Now she had a true purpose in life, her little bundle of joy. Jenny realized that for this little girl, she would move mountains, overcome any obstacle. And with each passing day, it became even harder for her to understand how her own mother could have willingly left her behind, choosing instead a life with strangers and endless parties. Jenny grew more and more resentful of Helen's choices. Unlike her own mother, Jenny became a model parent. She gave her best in everything, and even the small child support she received helped ease her financial burden, if only slightly. Jenny learned to stretch every dollar, buying groceries on sale and carefully planning each purchase. Yes, money was tight, but she managed, taking pride in the fact that she was providing for herself and her daughter on her own. Her pride grew. She was no longer the lost girl she had once been. In Jenny's plans, she hoped to raise Alyssa until the time came when her daughter could be enrolled in preschool, and then find work, maybe at the local post office or library, if an opportunity arose. Jenny dreamed of continuing her studies, but those plans were distant and, unfortunately, complicated. Life, however, didn't allow her much time for daydreaming. Everything changed with the arrival of Mike Sokolov. Mike was the son of her neighbors and a few years older than Jenny. He had left their small town for the city, where he got into a university, becoming what many considered a truly successful man. Jenny had been infatuated with him during her teenage years, just like many of the other girls in their town. So when Mike came over to visit, she couldn't help but feel thrilled by his presence. Although, to be fair, he was already a little drunk. He had been out with friends and had quite a bit to drink. But that didn't cast a shadow on their meeting. On the contrary, Jenny enjoyed his company, her heart racing as she looked into his gray eyes. Mike, shaking his head, said he didn't expect to find her in such a situation, holding a baby, living in the middle of nowhere. You are smart and beautiful. I thought you'd have a different future, he said, with a slightly tipsy attempt at deep thought. Jenny listened, trying to suppress the excitement and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Could their paths cross again? The night, filled with conversation, ended in an unexpected moment of intimacy. By morning, Mike, burning with embarrassment, hastily apologized and left. Jenny was left with a heavy feeling. She had believed they'd formed a connection, some kind of shared bond. But instead, it all ended as just a fleeting episode. Soon after, Jenny found out she was pregnant again. Jenny had grown used to the constant struggle for survival. Saving money, keeping track of every meager dollar of income and expense, had become a part of her daily life. She learned to make ends meet, constantly reassuring herself that she was managing the financial hardships. However, as her children grew older, Jenny became more aware that their needs would only increase. Alyssa and Stephen were getting older, and soon they would want new gadgets, fashionable clothes, and all the other things that would keep them from feeling out of place among their classmates. She didn't want her kids to feel different or less fortunate than their peers, but what could she do? Even the hardest of jobs weren't enough to cover all their needs. Jenny decided to take on extra jobs. Cleaning work was always in demand everywhere. But with each passing day, it became harder to endure the exhausting pace of life. Endless shifts, lack of sleep, and every morning felt like starting from scratch. Jenny was slowly turning into a shadow of her former self. Her eyes lost their sparkle, her shoulders slumped, and despair often weighed so heavily on her chest that it became hard to breathe. Yet she held on, clinging to her love for her children, willing to endure any hardship for their sake. Alyssa and Stephen couldn't know how hard things were for her, how utterly drained she felt. Sometimes, waves of sadness washed over Jenny. Two young children, constant struggle, and yet she had never been in a serious relationship. She felt ashamed to admit her vulnerability to anyone. After all, there was no one in the world who could support her, who could be there in her darkest moments. Her uncles, though they existed, had never shown much affection for her mother or Jenny herself, so she couldn't rely on them. The crushing weight of loneliness bore down on her constantly. No matter how hard Jenny worked, no matter how much effort she put in, she earned only just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Still, Alyssa and Stephen, though young, understood the situation and didn't ask for the impossible. They helped out as much as they could, cleaning the house, cooking simple meals, since Jenny often came home so late and exhausted that she barely had the energy to do anything but quickly tidy up and wish her kids good night. She would fall asleep before her head even hit the tiller. And then Andrew appeared. A man slightly older than her. He worked for the same apartment renovation company where Jenny worked a few days a week as a cleaner. At first, she didn't pay much attention to him. Andrew didn't stand out among the others, always quiet and brooding, lost in his own thoughts. But one day, he offered to help her carry the heavy buckets of water up to the fourth floor, and then, without waiting for her to ask, he started wiping down the windowsills and even helped with the floors, something Jenny would have done herself, risking her health on an old, rickety ladder. This unexpected act of kindness was a revelation to her. Until that moment, no one had ever helped her so selflessly. Jenny began to see Andrew in a new light. As Jenny got to talking with Andrew, she learned that he, too, had a difficult past. Once, he had a family, a wife and children, but his wife, unhappy with his low earnings, left him for another man, taking the kids with her. Andrew was devastated by the betrayal and decided to leave his hometown and move to the city, where everything reminded him of his painful past. In this new place, he found work, renting a small apartment, and thanks to his exceptional handyman skills, he became a sought-after repairman, working both for a company and privately. His life was quiet, almost solitary, and he had grown used to it. But meeting Jenny changed everything. Andrew saw how hard she fought to survive, raising 2 children on her own without any support, and his heart slowly opened to her. At first, it was pity, then admiration for her resilience, and eventually, he developed real, deep feelings for her. Andrew realized that he wanted to be by this woman's side, to take care of her and her children, to be the reliable support she so desperately needed. Jenny listened to Andrew, trying to believe that such happiness could be possible in her life. When Jenny found out she was pregnant again, she was unexpectedly filled with joy. It was a spark of hope in a life that had already seen so many hardships. But who could have imagined that Andrew would be the happiest of all? When he learned that he would have another child, it was as if he was transformed. With renewed energy, he started making plans for the future. Now his dream was to have their own home. Although renting an apartment was relatively affordable, Andrew longed for stability. After all, 3 children meant not just joy, but a huge responsibility. He began taking on more side jobs, sometimes at construction sites, other times unloading trucks. Andrew was willing to work himself to the bone just to provide for his family and save some money for their future. But then tragedy struck, and Jenny still couldn't recover from it. Andrew was killed in an accident at a construction site, crushed by a truck due to a basic safety violation caused by exhaustion. The news hit Jenny like an avalanche. She couldn't believe that the man she loved was gone, that she was once again alone, left to face this harsh, cold world. Her entire life suddenly lost its color. Everything seemed empty and joyless, as if the world had turned to fog and the future ceased to exist. The thought of living without Andrew filled her with panic. At that moment, Jenny often thought it would be easier if everything collapsed at once, if she could disappear with this shattered world. These were dangerous thoughts, and she knew it. But despite her despair, Jenny found the strength to live for her children, who had also lost someone they loved, and for Andrew's unborn child, who deserved to come into the world healthy and strong. Gathering all her willpower, Jenny decided to keep fighting, now without Andrew but not without his legacy. Thankfully, Andrew, anticipating potential difficulties, hadn't kept his savings in the bank but had hidden them at home. These funds saved Jenny during the difficult first months after his death. Without them, she wouldn't have been able to pay for the funeral, let alone survive during that time. Their plans for a future together collapsed in an instant, along with dreams of the wedding they never got to have. But life, as always, moved forward. Soon, Jenny gave birth to a daughter, and with the joy of motherhood came the harsh reality once again. At first, things were incredibly tough. The baby demanded attention, and there was barely any time or energy left for anything else. Money was tight, and Jenny had to stretch out their meager supplies, dressing the kids in old clothes donated by friends. Jenny found herself once again trapped in the endless cycle of survival, which felt like a curse. But she didn't give up. When Oleana grew up and started attending daycare, Jenny was able to return to work. Things started getting a little easier, The baby was rarely sick, meaning Jenny could work without constantly taking time off. Over time, life began to stabilize. The children grew older, became more independent, and one day, fate offered Jenny an unexpected opportunity to change her life. One of the tenants in the building where she cleaned floors noticed her hard work and suggested she apply for a job at a local hotel. "You're slim, pleasant looking, and, most importantly, you're great with people and not afraid of hard work. We could use someone like you," he told her. Jenny decided to give it a shot, though she didn't expect much. But fortune smiled on her. She got the job. Working at the hotel was far more enjoyable and less exhausting than cleaning apartment buildings, and most importantly, the pay was much better. Plus, the tips were sometimes quite generous. Jenny began to feel like life was gaining color again. Although she still missed Andrew, his care, his voice, his scent, her loneliness no longer weighed on her as heavily. Moreover, she was finally able to take her children to the ocean, a trip they had all dreamed of for so long. It was nothing short of a miracle. It was the first time they saw the sea, and the experience would stay with them forever. Jenny watched her children's happiness, and it gave her the strength to keep going. Despite the visible improvements, loneliness remained her constant companion. Jenny often wondered, what would happen if something were to happen to her? Where would her children go? Her uncles, who hardly ever stayed in touch, were unlikely to take responsibility for her family. These thoughts terrified Jenny, but she pushed them aside, trying to focus on the present. She frequently thought about her grandmother, Evelyn, a woman who had been her rock, her protector. Jenny was anxious, overwhelmed with worry, but she knew one thing. She had to find Fred Peterson and uncover the truth that had been haunting her. Early one morning, she left her home and, after a long journey, arrived in New York City by the afternoon. She had expected Fred Peterson's office to be hard to access, filled with barriers and guarded by strict security. But in reality, it was much simpler. When she asked how to see Fred Peterson, the receptionist, a young, friendly woman, smiled and pointed her to the office where the man was receiving visitors. It was open hours when anyone could come to discuss matters concerning his restaurants, leave complaints, or even express gratitude. Feeling a little nervous, Jenny stepped into the office. She had expected to see something luxurious, a display of wealth and status fitting for such a well-known businessman, but she was surprised by the simplicity and practicality of the space. The room's minimalist design exuded a calm, functional atmosphere, even a touch of warmth. Fred Peterson, sitting behind a large wooden desk, didn't appear commanding or distant. Instead, he seemed approachable and friendly. His genuine smile and attentive gaze helped Jenny relax a little, though her heart still raced. "Hello," Jenny greeted him, her voice slightly trembling. Fred Peterson responded with the same warmth and gestured for her to take a seat in the chair across from him. His calm demeanor made the setting feel less formal, and Jenny suddenly realized that all the carefully rehearsed lines and questions she had prepared had flown from her mind. "Do you have a question or perhaps a proposal for me?" Fred Peterson asked with a slight smile, noticing her hesitation. "Don't be shy. You can say whatever you need. I always appreciate honesty, even if it's uncomfortable." Those words helped Jenny gather her thoughts, but the nervousness still weighed heavily on her. "No," she shook her head, taking a deep breath. "I'm here for something else entirely." Her hand reached into her bag, and she pulled out a locket. For a moment, Jenny silently looked at it, feeling as though this small object had become the center of her life. She handed it to Fred Peterson, who watched her closely. "I'm a housekeeper at the hotel where you recently stayed. I found this locket in your room," Jenny said in a quiet but firm voice. At first, Fred Peterson looked puzzled, but then his face lit up with joy. "You found it," he exclaimed, immediately taking the locket in his hands and examining it closely. "I was sure I had lost it at the train station. I thought I'd never see it again." "Old age is no fun," he joked, glancing at Jenny with a smile. "Did you come all the way to New York just to return this to me?" Fred Peterson looked at Jenny with genuine interest. He clearly hadn't expected such a gesture. "You could have just handed it to the front desk. Why go to all this trouble? I could have sent someone to pick it up." Jenny silently looked at the locket in Fred Peterson's hands, then decisively raised her head. "The thing is, the photo inside the locket, it's my grandmother," she said, looking him straight in the eye. Fred Peterson froze. His face immediately grew serious, the smile fading. He stared at Jenny, as though trying to process her words. "What was your grandmother's name?" he asked slowly, as if fearing the answer. "Evelyn," Jenny said softly. This time, Fred Peterson's surprise was even more apparent. His face flushed, and he couldn't hide his shock. "Evelyn," he repeated, as though trying to fit the name into his memory. "I can't believe it. So your grandmother was Evelyn." He fell silent, digesting the information, and finally looked up at Jenny. "Your grandmother was the closest person to me. I searched for her for years, but it was all in vain. And now, you. Tell me, how did you know her? How is this possible?" Jenny straightened, trying to collect her thoughts. She understood that this conversation would be long and might reveal new, unexpected chapters of her family's history. "Please, tell me how you knew her." "I want to know everything," she asked, feeling a mix of fear and hope swirling inside her. Someone had failed to put out their cigarette properly. Paul's grandmother, whenever she scolded his parents, often predicted that they would burn the house down one day. And now, her words had come true. Fear gripped Freddie, desperate and all-consuming. He opened the attic window, but the height scared him. The ground was far too distant, and one wrong step could break his neck. Returning to the smoke-filled room was equally terrifying, but he had no other choice. Feeling his way through the darkness, Freddie stumbled over scattered belongings, as if the house itself, in its agonizing death throes, was trying to throw everything unnecessary away. Downstairs, the flames raged, devouring the wallpaper, curtains, and furniture with savage hunger. The exit seemed far off, almost unreachable. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and the air thickened with smoke. Every breath became torture. Freddie had never been so scared in his life. He screamed, but his voice seemed lost in the roaring sounds of the fire. Where was everyone? Had they run off and left him, or had they perished in the flames? Freddie tried to take another breath, but his chest wouldn't cooperate. The world spun around him, blurring into darkness. His last thought before slipping into unconsciousness was that he was going to die. So his shock was immense when he opened his eyes again and saw the black, starry sky above. The cool night air washed over his face, and breathing became easier, though his head still swam. Someone was carrying him, and when Shreddy turned his head, he saw Evelyn's soot-covered face, both worried and relieved. "You're alive," she whispered, letting out a breath of pure relief. "Thank God, you're alive. I thought I was too late." Shreddy then noticed other people around them. They were rushing toward them from all directions. Someone covered him with a blanket, another person offered him water. He glanced back and saw the flames consuming his house, the same attic he had been trapped in just moments before. "Evelyn, you pulled a soul out of the fire," said one of the men standing nearby. "We were too scared to go in, but you didn't hesitate. You're one incredible person." From that point on, Shreddy stayed with Evelyn. He had nowhere else to go, his house had burned down, and his parents had perished in the fire. When Shreddy learned this, he didn't feel pain or fear, just confusion. It was hard for him to comprehend that they were gone, that he was now completely alone. Later, neighbors explained that the fire had been started by one of the drunken guests. Some managed to escape, but others, including Freddy's parents, died in the blaze. Freddy would have met the same fate if not for the scream that Evelyn had heard. Like everyone else, she had rushed to the fire, ready to help in any way she could. But upon hearing Freddy's desperate cries from within the flames, she couldn't just stand by. People tried to dissuade her, telling her it was too dangerous and pointless, but she didn't let fear stop her. She charged into the burning house, pushing through the smoke and flames, and found the boy, carrying him out in her arms. Her eyelashes and eyebrows had been singed by the fire, and her hands bore deep burns that took a long time to heal. But to her, it was nothing compared to the fact that she had saved Freddy's life. The boy was alive, and that was the only thing that mattered to Evelyn on that terrible night. Life with Evelyn was completely new and wondrous for Shreddy. She was kind, cheerful, and caring. Her home was clean, warm, and cozy. She read him books and told him stories he had never heard before. One day, Evelyn threw him a birthday party, the first one in his life. She baked a cake and bought him a gift, a soccer ball. She invited the local kids to the party, and from that day on, Freddy began playing with them. Until then, they had kept their distance, seeing him as an outsider. But thanks to Evelyn, Freddy now had friends. She was still young, but she cared for Freddy like a real mother. She taught him how to use cutlery, make his bed, and talk to people, and later, she taught him how to read and write. But most importantly, she loved him. She often hugged him, said kind words, and gradually, Freddy transformed from a wild, frightened boy into a person. Evelyn planned to adopt him officially, but it wasn't easy. The paperwork and government procedures took time. Leaving Freddy with the neighbors, she went to the city, expecting to be gone for only a week, but it stretched into a whole month. Before she left, she gave him the very same locket that held her photograph. "See, I'll be with you, even when I'm not around," she said, handing him the locket. "If you ever feel lonely or sad, just open it and look at me. You can tell me everything that's on your mind, and I'll hear you. I promise." But during this time, Freddy's relatives showed up, a cousin and her husband. Suddenly, they decided they wanted to take him in. On the journey to their home, Freddy had a complete meltdown. Fear, anger, and confusion overwhelmed him so intensely that he couldn't control himself. But the woman, whom he now had to call Tant, quickly put an end to his crying with a sharp slap across the face. From that moment on, she no longer coddled him, neither on the journey nor afterward. Their relationship from then on was built on force and cold detachment. They didn't love Freddie, they only tolerated him because of the inheritance he was due to receive. Life with them was unbearable. Cold, unfriendly chases, a house devoid of warmth or comfort. Freddie did everything he could to stay away. He signed up for every school club and joined any possible activities, just to avoid the nightmare of being in that house. When Fred turned 14, his loving dad, who had long considered him a burden, sent him off to a boarding school. He lived there like a prisoner within cold walls, but even that was better than returning to people who saw him only as a means of financial gain. Upon reaching adulthood, Fred joined the army, where he trained as a driver, which became the launching point for his new life. After being discharged, he didn't return to his relatives. Their mutual relief at his departure was palpable. Fred rented a small room and got a job at a dairy factory. Life seemed to be taking shape, but fate intervened once again. The factory manager, noticing Fred's resourcefulness and work ethic, urged him to apply to college. At first, Fred resisted. The idea of university seemed far out of reach, but he couldn't refuse his boss. Over time, he got into the rhythm of it and eventually became the top student in his class. Success came unexpectedly but deservedly. After graduation, Fred was offered a position as a manager at a well-known restaurant. There, he gained invaluable experience in management, learning all the intricacies of the restaurant business. Soon, he began formulating plans to open his own cafe. Slowly, piece by piece, Fred saved up enough for a down payment and started his business. Those were tough times, filled with constant ups and downs, learning from mistakes, and working tirelessly from morning until night. He made it a point to understand every detail, controlling all processes down to the smallest nuances. But his determination and desire to succeed paid off. Over time, Fred managed to build a chain of restaurants with a stellar reputation. Now, he had everything: money, a career he loved, influence, and power. But along with success came another feeling, the desire to find the person who had once given him a chance at life. Evelyn, the simple girl from the small town who had saved him, was always on his mind. Fred longed to find her, to thank her, to look into her kind eyes again, and to tell her who he had become, to show her that he had never forgotten what she had done for him. She meant more to him than any blood relative. But finding her proved to be difficult. The small town where Fred was born and raised no longer existed. Years had passed, much had changed, and Evelyn's trail seemed to have vanished into time. Private investigators were unable to find any mention of her. Fred gradually realized that he knew very little about his savior, only her name and approximate age. His heart sank at the thought that the person who had meant more to him than his own family might have already passed away. The locket she had given him before leaving became Fred's talisman for many years. He never parted with it, not for a single day, and he even spoke to it when he was completely alone. This locket, Fred would say, shaking his head, it gave me strength. I don't know how to explain it, but I really talked to Evelyn through it. Even when I grew up and knew she couldn't hear me, I kept telling her everything that troubled me. About my aunt, about the mean teachers. And it made me feel better. That was my kind of therapy. Fred eventually got married, and they had 2 sons. He named one of them after Evelyn, in memory of the woman who had given him not only life but also a sense of humanity.